Hey everyone, it's Anne. We're recording 3 episodes next week, and we're still taking questions. We're talking about celebrity feuds, so like celebrities that hate each other, celebrities that secretly hate each other, celebrities that like very obviously hate each other, any of those questions, past and present. We're talking about dad culture, which can mean so many things. It can be a question about like, why does it feel like dad's like this thing? What is the stereotype of a dad? This is with my friend Phil, who is teaching a dad studies class this semester. It's going to be also amazing. And then we're talking about the world of preteen influencers with someone who has firsthand experience with that sphere. It's not a preteen influencer. That's not my co-host, but it's going to be great. You know the drill. Head to tinyurl.com/culturestudypod and let us know what questions you have. Thanks, and here's today's show. So you sent me an image that I had like kind of seen, but maybe like disposed into the back of my head. It's of the new like Skims North Face ski line. Can you tell me about this photo and what you think it symbolizes about skiing today?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So this is one of my current obsessions. Skims, Kim Kardashian's brand, and the North Face, which is sort of a classic, like outdoor brand, released a collaboration. And it looks like, I guess it looks exactly like you think it would look. It looks like Skims when skiing. So it's sort of all of these like flesh-toned, really form-fitting, like stretch pants. And the art for the launch is all this sort of like very organized, like people skiing in formation. It's just like such this interesting nexus, I think, of skiing and sort of identity and what I think skiing like can mean for people, and also
but also like wealth, like in like such
totally.
this like a clean way. Okay, let's first table set just a little bit. How old are you?
I am 40. I'm about to be 41.
Okay, I'm 43. So when we were growing up, the like rich ski person, what did they wear?
They had the North Face like Sherpa puffy coat.
Yes.
I remember
with, like fur lined, right?
My best friend in high school had one, and it's so interesting because the Skim stuff like totally calls back to that. They have that sort of like cropped puffer jacket, but in this sort of elite way.
The legging tights, right, that you would tuck into your boots. And so it created almost like, this was before like leggings were a thing again, but it created this particular sort of line with your ski boots that were meant to like blend into the line of the tight pants that to me, I was like, that person doesn't really know how to ski.
This is like, this link has been, circulating in my, women in skiing group chat, and there's really strong opinions about it. And I think that that's part of it, and that was sort of my, and maybe this is also me being 40, but my sort of like first reaction to it was like, well, that's not practical. Like, you're gonna be cold.
Also, are they even wearing helmets? No, they're wearing hats.
Ooh, yeah. And it just is that like, okay, who is this for? And also like, who is skiing for? And on some level, I'm like, Kim Kardashian loves to ski, and this is like a fun project for her. Like, get it, like, go for it.
Yeah,
but
totally.
But yeah, it is that kind of like, okay, who is the demographic what's the Venn diagram of somebody who wants to be on a mountain, and somebody who has that particular aesthetic, and somebody who also has the money to acquire all that.
Right. And something that we're going to talk about a lot today, which is like an understanding of skiing as a like high bourgeois activity, not even just like a middle class activity, but like a rich person activity. Hi, everyone. This is the Culture Study Podcast, and I'm Anne Helen Peterson.
And I'm Heather Hansman, and I am the author of the book Powder Days. I'm a contributing editor at Outside Magazine, and I'm really excited to talk about skiing today.
And I am a huge fan. We just talked about this like in the pre-show about how I'm so excited for this conversation. And not just because my legs are still sore today from skiing yesterday and totally clearing my entire schedule in a way that was like pretty complicated and like kind of inconveniencing Melody. And I was like, Melody, thank you for tolerating my hobby. And she's literally said, what is being a freelancer for if not being able to like clear your schedule for a hobby? But we're going to start by actually talking about, what is your earliest memory of skiing?
I grew up in a family that skied. I grew up in Massachusetts. We were close to the mountains. We would go on weekend trips and stuff, but I didn't grow up in a like ski all the time, have a mountain house family. Like I kind of came to the obsession on my own terms. But I have this very clear memory of I was 7 and I was skiing with my dad, and the blue run that we were going to ski was closed. And so he decided to take me on a black run. And he was like, okay, if you get going too fast, all you have to do is fall down. That'll stop you. Yeah. So I was like, okay, I got this. And so I, little me picks up all the speed, falls down, just, follows instructions, falls down on my hand and breaks my thumb.
Oh no.
and I have this very clear memory of like being in the clinic at the bottom of the mountain and my mom coming, she'd been with my brother or something, and my mom coming in and just being like, John, like, what did you do to her? So I think there is this sort of like, excitement and danger from the beginning.
Also, I think telling, because in the black diamonds that I would ski growing up, there's no way that you could ever go fast enough to like hurt yourself, because it's just like always just chock full of powder. Whereas like in a lot of mountains, especially out east, it's very icy and like you can get going really fast. And that has always been like an interesting difference to me. Part of the reason I was so excited to do this episode is because I have accumulated so many feelings about skiing, and a lot of them have been amplified over the course of the last 4 years when I have taken skiing back up as an adult. I grew up in a small town in Idaho, and starting when I was 7 or 8, we skied, I don't know, probably like 20 to 30 days a year, but we didn't have a ski house or a cabin. The ski resort where we went was 3 hours away plus an hour in time change, because we'd go over the mountain time zone line. And so it required a tremendous amount of effort on the part of my parents to drive down there. It's also like probably one of the most treacherous drives to regularly take in the West. It includes a pass that is like notorious amongst truck drivers as one of the scariest passes. It's called White Bird Pass. But I loved it, and I was not an athletic kid. I did not like sports in any capacity, but I really took to skiing and fell in love with being good at something that probably part of the reason I loved it was because it was outside of the eyes of, all the cool kids that I knew. I had ski friends that I loved and that I loved to goof around with. And like, we were always like dropping a pole from the lift and like, let's pretend we're French and like only speak in French words. Like, just the games that you play as a kid. And we skied without our parents most of the time, which was an incredible amount of freedom. And then also the mountain that I grew up skiing on and where we had season passes to is on Forest Service land. There were no condos or anything on the mountain. You had to drive up 30 minutes to get up there from the ski town. There was no like après scene. The first time that I ever experienced that, which was as a college freshman at Whistler, I was like, what is happening? Everything is so expensive. It was so incredibly alienating and scary to me to even have like lunch options. I was like, what do you mean you have to spend like $15 for a burger? Why is everyone not we only picnicked, or like sometimes you'd buy a cup of noodle, like
Definitely.
It was just a very, very different experience for me. And I found myself as an adult, when I graduated from college, I no longer had, the ability to go back to my home mountain, and my ski stuff got old. And then I was a graduate student, and I was poor, and I lived in Texas. Like there were all of these things that kept me from coming back. And it really wasn't until I moved back west that I revisited and regained that incredible love and freedom of it. And now my home mountain is a mountain that's a lot like the one where I grew up skiing, and that's very important to me. But that has also going skiing all the time, like each time that I'm on the chairlift, it brings back all of these memories and gives me opportunity to process a lot of the like ways that mountains have changed, the class connotations, all of those things. So that's my long spiel that gets us.
There's a lot there.
And like you have such an interesting story too, and you really trace it eloquently in your book. And so it's similar to what I just did. Can you set us up a little bit about your like vantage point towards skiing?
Yeah. And one of the things that you kind of just drilled into there is like one of the things that I'm most interested in all this, which is sort of this like idea of obsession.
Yeah.
Like what makes your parents drive their kids, 3 hours every weekend to go do this thing that's like objectively like expensive and sort of stupid and potentially dangerous.
Right.
And like,
Right.
what is that thing about skiing that like hooks people? Because it hooked me. And like I said earlier, like I grew up in Boston area, and I got really hooked into skiing in high school. My high school had a really good ski club.
Oh, interesting.
Where I sold breakfast at the high school so I could ski for free.
Yeah.
And it was like, I was kind of similar, like I like always did sports as a kid, but there wasn't anything that was like my thing. And all of a sudden with ski club, it was like, I had this group of friends. There were cool older boys. I had a thing to do on the weekend. It was just like this thing that like I felt good in my body. Like it clicked in all these ways. And from there, I went to college in Maine, skied a bunch. And then I did this sort of like classic ski bum thing where right after college, I moved to Colorado. And I got a job with two of my good friends from college. I got a job scanning lift tickets for like $6 an hour at Beaver Creek, which is one of those like it's one of the probably like 3 fanciest ski areas in the country. There's heated sidewalks and free cookies and all this. So I was automatically kind of thrown into this very fancy, like I became part of the service side of this very fancy elite institution. Yeah, I had grown up skiing sort of like scrubby mountains in New Hampshire and Massachusetts where you like leave your boot bag under the table and like have your peanut butter and jelly, and all of a sudden was like, oh, skiing is a lot of things.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly how to say it. Skiing is so many things that I understood.
Yeah. And I think like to kind of circle back to that Kardashian thing, like that is a piece of it, but I don't think that's the whole picture. And so I, showed up in the mountains as a 21-year-old fresh out of college on my own for the first time. And I really sort of like fell in love with this lifestyle where I got to be outside every day, my community, my sense of self, my, activities, my hobbies all kind of got rolled into one thing. And I got really obsessed with this idea. And I did that for a couple of years. And then I ended up getting hurt and kind of couldn't work seasonally anymore and washed out of, living in a ski town, working on the mountain. And I went to journalism school and became a magazine editor, which is, unstable and not lucrative in other ways. But I sort of watched, as I was doing that, I kind of watched my friends that I had been, 21 and 22 with try to establish themselves in these towns and hold on to jobs and start families. And I sort of had this really interesting sliding doors of my own life where I could kind of look at that life and this idea of like living the dream and living in the mountains and being outside all the time. And I could kind of see the good and the hard parts of that. And also I kind of had this question of like, is that still the dream? Is that a good dream? What's all wrapped up in that dream of skiing? Yeah. And that really kind of, that question about my own life and how it spirals out into, work and economies and climate and community kind of became the bones for this book that is Powder Days.
So one last thing that we should do, some table setting, because sometimes I think, because of where I grew up and where I live now, like even if people don't ski, they're very familiar with like categories of skiing or, you know what I mean? Like all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So just for listeners who aren't as familiar with ski culture, can you like give me like a couple buckets of types of skiers?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. What's the best way do you mean in terms of like,
okay, let me maybe I can start us out because I think it's actually changed a lot in the last 20 years. So when I was growing up, you had people who had been skiing for generations in their family. And a lot of these people grew up in places like, are near or around ski places and might have really old cabins that were in their family for a long time. Not fancy, but they were there. And so like the thing I always think about in terms of like who had a season pass at our ski mountain, like the people I saw all the time were my first grade teacher and my barber, right? And they were some of the best skiers that I knew. And they had a little cabin that had been in like their family and they were like many generations old Idahoans. And like the secretary of my high school also would go skiing all the time. And like, then there were also a lot of doctors' kids. So it's like this kind of mix of middle class and like upper working class who would all be at the mountain. And because of the style of mountain that it was, sometimes you would be like, oh, look at that person skiing in jeans. But there would be a lot of people skiing in jeans at the mountain
Yeah.
and just wearing like
Yeah.
their starter jacket. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think there's sort of like, there's an interesting geographic stratification there. And there's been and we can totally get into the weeds on this stuff, but there's also been a split in the past 5 to 7 years
Yep.
in terms of resort management and ski passes and how ski passes work. And I think that's really changed how people access the mountains and how they go, and whether they're sort of like what you're talking about, where you have a local mountain where you maybe go every weekend or a lot, or you're going on like a ski vacation.
Yeah.
You're going on a trip and you're going to, an Aspen or a Park City or something like that. So I think there is this really deep stratification of like what skiing can look like. And I think it can be like where I live in Durango, we have like a local resort mountain, 25 minutes up the road, but we also have an in-town ski hill.
Yeah.
And that has 2 rope tows and it's like $10 to go. And so that skiing can be that, skiing can be, you go after school, the lights are on, you're like, the base area is also the hockey rink for town.
Yeah.
And skiing can also be, you're going to Jackson Hole for a week and spending, $50,000 on your vacation. I mean, skiing can also be, you're going heli skiing and like flying to Alaska. So there is this like very broad range of what skiing can look like, I think. And there's a lot of like middle of ground there.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of another like sport that has that sort of range, and one of the things that comes to mind is like cycling. You can bike around town on like the old beater that you've had in your, like that was your mom's, that's in your garage, and like if you pump it up and grease the wheel, like the chain, then it still works, and it's fun, right? Because you're moving. And that to me is like, little ski hills are still fun because you're like, you're going fast, you're going up a rope tow, like it's super, there's always like pleasure in that. And then you can like have a $25,000 bike and like be taking cycling trips, tracing the route of like the Tour de France, There's all sorts of access points in that way.
Yeah. And skiing is like interesting in that part because, and then maybe like golf is an analogy too, even though I think that's kind of funky, but like you have to do it in specific places. Like cycle, you can go, like I can go out my front door and go cycling, and like with skiing, you have to go somewhere where there's infrastructure. So like that's another piece of it too, that there has to be a venue for it, and you have to be plugged into that.
Yeah. And with golfing, like there are like muni courses, municipal courses.
Yeah, like a city course.
And also like golf in the United States, we've privatized it so thoroughly and like made it into such like a profit center that it's incredibly expensive. Whereas like there are avenues that make it more affordable in Europe.
And there's also all these like cultural signifiers attached to it about like what it means to be a golf. What gear do you have? Where do you go?
Yeah. All that's okay. Let's get into our questions where we're going to touch on so much more of this. So this is about the cost of skiing and how it's changed. And I think it'll give us an opportunity to talk about the changes that have occurred, especially over, say, the last 5 years. This question comes from Laura, and Melody's going to read it.
I was born and raised in Colorado and love skiing. I'm constantly grateful that my parents, who rode that line between poverty and lower middle class, scrimped, saved, and hustled to get at least one ski day a year to teach my siblings and me to ski. I'm not sure that what they did would be possible today, and I'd love to see more families in lower socioeconomic situations access skiing. Besides cost, which is prohibitive, how can people in the industry reduce the barriers to entry, or is it just an exclusive activity?
Okay, so before we answer Laura's actual question, I think this is the place where we can talk a little bit about how the conglomeration of ski resorts has changed the landscape in significant ways. So I know it's hard to talk about in like a paragraph, but maybe we can try.
There's sort of like two buckets in that question, I think. And I think how do people who aren't exorbitantly wealthy and have a ton of extra money access skiing? And I think part of why that's gotten hard lately is because, there's a couple factors. One of them is that it's really hard to run. Skiing is not, if you're operating a ski hill, it's not a particularly lucrative business.
Nope.
And that's gotten even harder in climate change.
Yep.
Because seasons are more variable. There's all these other factors that just make it hard. And in the face of that, two big corporations, Vail Resorts and Alterra, have bought up or managed most of the major ski resorts in the US. And that's like everything like your Vail, your Killington, your Snowbird, your Crystal in Washington, like most of the sort of like brand name ski resorts are now under the umbrella of one of those two companies.
Yeah.
And that sets up this like basic duopoly in skiing where those two companies can now set pricing for lift tickets, for food, for what they pay people at the resorts. And so what they do is that they now offer these mega passes. So if you get a Vail Resorts pass, that means you have access to, I'm not going to get the numbers right off the top of my head, but say 40 ski resorts that you can go to.
Yeah.
So if you're somebody, and that pass is say $1,000. And if you're somebody who has the ability to travel to go to a bunch of ski areas, who has the flexibility to go, it's a pretty good deal.
Yeah.
And it makes sense on some level from the resort management side because they're consolidated. They can kind of ride those climate waves. If, say, it's snowing in California but not in New Hampshire, they're a little bit more diversified. But if you're somebody who is maybe wants to get into skiing, maybe has one weekend a year that you can go on a trip, those passes are probably cost prohibitive. And the way that those guys structure their businesses now is that they keep the single day ticket prices pretty high and make the passes comparatively affordable. So if you want to go ski at Vail over Christmas week, it's like almost $300 for a day ticket.
Right. And they also do variable pricing. Not just like Christmas Day or Christmas week or whatever, but like if the snow's good and there's lots of people who want to go, then it's more expensive.
Yeah. They now have the data to be able to kind of like make those prices go up and down when they know it's going to be busy. Yeah. So that makes the barrier for entry of somebody who's a beginner, somebody who doesn't have that economic or social structure already in place that they know they want to go. They know it's worth it really hard. I can see in a lot of ways why those organizations would do that from a business standpoint, but from a pathway into the sport perspective, from, like broadening the audience who's going to like be a part of this forever or for the future, it makes it really narrow eventually.
Yeah. Well, and skiing's one of those things that I think a lot of sports are like this to some capacity, but if your parents don't do it, if a parent doesn't do it, or another adult in your life, like it's sometimes difficult to get into it yourself unless there is an infrastructure. So I've lived in places where there are really robust like PE programs for skiing.
Yeah.
Where they go to the mountain once a week. And a lot of times they put kids in just rental skis for that week. And like the mountain understands we're essentially rearing new skiers.
Yeah, we're building that kind of like future customer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of those small ski hills have a, or a avenue into that. Yeah. And, to part of that question, like how do we reduce barriers to entry and how do we get people into the sport? I think there's sort of two pieces of that. And one of them is that like pathway in, like how do you get people hooked in the first place? And skiing is really a high barrier to entry sport. You need a
it's
lot
hard.
Of weird gear. It's often in places that are hard to access. Yeah. And a lot of times if you don't have somebody actively bringing you in, it's a big hurdle to get going. And I think a lot of those like my husband grew up in Portland, Oregon, and he got into skiing because they had a ski bus. So they would go after school a couple days a week. And that was like the thing that became the pathway. And I think in a lot of places, like if you're not in a family or in a community that's like actively part of it, I think there are pathways, there's affinity groups, but it takes a little bit more work to get there.
Totally. You have to have someone who's like very, very into it, whether that's like the person who runs the ski bus or a parent or something like that. Yeah. And it's not like running where you're like, okay, now move your legs fast.
Yeah.
Right? Like this is the thing that I think people who don't ski or who have skied a couple times and are like, this is really hard.
Yeah, that if you're an adult, you have a long way to fall.
My partner, I'm like so impressed. He learned to ski 4 years ago. And like he was describing himself skiing the other day. He was like, big tree fall hard. Like just how much harder it is to learn to ski when you're an adult and how much like more treacherous and painful. I think of some of the falls that he's taken over the last 4 years, and I can't think of any. Like I did yard sales all the time when I was learning to ski, but I never. A yard sale, sorry, I'm using ski lingo. A yard sale is when you like lose like you fall and you like lose your mitten and you lose your hat and your goggles and it's just like horrible.
It's always right under the chairlift.
Always right under the chairlift. But like I never experienced pain the way that he has experienced pain from falling. So I think that there's just a lot of barriers to entry, and if you haven't. Yeah. And that's not even talking about the money component. I do think that like skiing often gets this like, oh my God, it's so expensive. Only rich people can ski. That discounts not only like, so at my local mountain, Mount Baker, all fifth graders have free passes and kids' passes are very steeply discounted. Yes, you would have to pay for a parent's pass, but like that makes it a little bit easier for people who are families to have a trip there. And then the other thing too is like the existence, there's a robust secondhand ski equipment market that sometimes if you look at the sticker price of ski equipment, it looks incredibly prohibitive. But if you just like, especially for kids skis, if you just like people are growing out of them so fast and they still have so much life on them that like you can get really great stuff on that secondhand market.
Yeah, you were asking about early ski memories earlier. And like one of mine is going to, I think it was called Ski Barn. And it was like in a basement of the, like upstairs was like the nice ski shop. And then you would go down in the basement and they had last year's rentals and all the kind of exchange gear. And we would get season rentals of like used kids gear. So you'd have like your skis for that year and then you'd send them back at the end of the season. And then next year, when you were bigger, you would get like the next size up.
Yeah, my friends' kids do that, and it's like incredible for them. And then even just like ski swaps, like a ski swap is when lots of people bring in all of their old ski stuff that they want to get new ski stuff or like, refresh in some way. And then like it's just like a giant yard sale, but you're not personally manning the booth. It's like it's in a like incredible abundance, and everyone there is just like there's so much great energy.
Yeah, and for us here, that's sort of like one of those markers for like, okay, this is the beginning of winter.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's part of like one of the, there's like, obviously many things I like love about skiing, but like one of them is just like, okay, this is like the time of the year when we're doing this thing. And there's the buildup, there's the ski movies, there's the like, you get your gear sorted. And I think that's like that ski swap kind of community aspect is a piece of that.
Yeah. Yeah. You take out your bag where all of your ski stuff has lived for the last year. And like, you're like, oh, that neck warmer is like
left
kind
the string cheese in the pocket.
100%. Okay, so we've talked a lot about our own experiences, but for this next question from Elle, she's going to put us on blast a little bit and let us talk about the outside perception of skiing.
Why do skiers suck so much? As in, why do they make me feel so awful for not skiing? And why do they always sound absolutely baffled at the prospect of someone they know not owning skis? Don't they know it's a ludicrously expensive hobby? It's made me never want to learn to ski, even if it sounds like a fun luxury.
Okay, so I want to get to the heart of this, which is I think that like sort of like running or lots of other hobbies, there is something that is difficult to describe when you love it.
Yeah, I think that, and I've struggled with this in trying to write about skiing and like what it actually feels like, because everything sounds so sort of like foofy and dumb when you try to explain it. Like there's no good adjectives really for like what happens in your body.
Yeah, I think that for me, part of it, and this might also be rooted in the fact that I took, 20 years away and then came back to it. Like I love going really fast. Mm-hmm. And I do not like on a bike. I do like I'm the person breaking down the hills, right? But on skis, like I have the confidence to go really fast. So that is incredibly like makes me feel very alive in my body. And then it makes me feel like a kid. Like I go and like hang out on little jumps in the hills, and I'm like not doing anything cool. Like I'm doing things that are very not cool. But I'm like I'm 11. Like that's what it feels like in my body.
I've thought about like this is. I wrote a whole book about skiing, and like in a lot of thinking about that, I was like, is this stupid? Is this elitist? Is this even worth digging into? And like one of the things that I like came to in thinking about that is like, okay, why do I keep coming back to this? And I think it is kind of what you're saying, and that like skiing for me is one of the only things I can think of that I do that's like just for joy.
Yep.
And like, if
Yep.
I go for a bike ride, there's like probably an exercise component baked into that. But like of the things that I do that are just like purely fun, skiing is like one of the only things I can think of that's like uncomplicated in that aspect.
Yeah.
And I think there's like, I know you think a lot about hobbies and like how we kind of spend our time. And like, I think there is a huge amount of value in that. Like, here's a thing that's like exists outside of like my sense of productivity or like how I show up in the world. That's like just for like how it feels in my body.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's hard to untangle that from all that other stuff about money, about how other people perceive it, about what you're wearing, and about all those things. But I think like at its like very core, that's what it feels like to me.
It's useful to me that I don't go to a fancy place where it makes me think about, oh my God, I'm spending so much money here. That's useful. And then also that like the people that are at this mountain and the mountain itself is not pretentious in any way. And part of it is also it's drawing from like the Bellingham area, which is not a like ostensibly a pretentious area. So I'm never like, there's no one in Skims. I'll tell you that. Not one single person.
Who shows up at Baker and Skims? I will be so curious. Yeah. And
they would get like so wet. Yesterday they would have been dripping. They would have melted.
Your butt
into
would
the
be
ground.
so soggy on the lift.
There's not even, like we don't. Yeah. Anyway, and then I also think like ritual is part of why people love it too.
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought about that?
Yeah. In terms of like the seasonal aspect, in terms of like the ritual of the day, I think about that like even in terms of like the people that I see.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a point in the year in a lot of places that I live where like that kind of early season, like, oh, we go see the ski movies. All of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, Jimmy, like I haven't seen you since March. And so I think that whole sort of like, the community aspect, the sort of like, even the ritual of getting your gear, getting dressed, getting in the car and listening to music, going back to the parking lot and like having a beer in the parking lot, all those pieces can be part of this sort of like, I think ritual is a really good way of putting it.
I love like the sound of people clomping downstairs in ski boots. It's such a particular sound and everyone has to do it if you're wearing ski boots. Like you have to like use the railing and like be awkward. And yesterday there was this incredible couple in their like late 70s who was up at the mountain and they were just taking like a midday break to have a coffee and a cookie. And the woman was like going down the stairs in front of me and I was like, even when I'm that old, I'm going to have like, especially when I'm that old, I'm going to make the same sound in my boots and that like a 5-year-old makes when they're clomping down the stairs.
Totally. And I think that's like, I don't know, even just like the image of those people, like that's the dream. Like
my God. Yes.
My parents now my mom's retired. My parents live 10 minutes from a ski hill in New Hampshire. And like the other day they were like, we just like went up for an hour at 9 a.m. And I was like, yep, that's the thing.
And I love that we're answering this question about why ski people are so annoying with like us just talking about why we love skiing.
Or not, And I think that like, this is why it's sort of hard to like wrap your arms around because I think skiing is all of that. And there definitely is a sector that is, I mean, these people that you talk about sound particularly annoying, but there is a sector that's like, I go on a ski trip because that's like a cool thing to do. I get the whole outfit. I'm going to like the restaurants in Aspen that are fancy. Like I think there is a clump of people who do that, but I think that that's not, and I think that kind of gets a lot of light and attention, but I don't think that's like the breadth of skiing.
So I hope you're familiar with both of these movies. I feel like you have to be because you were similar age. There are 2 movies that I think get at the heart of annoying ski culture, but one is incredibly endearing to me and one whatever. So the first one that I think of when I think of ski culture is Aspen Extreme, which is like super fancy people skiing, right? And like lots of like bad behavior. And then the other one is Ski Patrol, which my brother and I wore out on VHS. Do you know this movie?
I've only seen Ski Patrol once, I think, but Aspen Extreme is something I think about all the time.
So Ski Patrol is an incredibly goofy movie, but it's about a bunch of like weirdos, many of whom work for the mountain and some don't, but like about skiing as goofing off and about it as in group in terms of like in jokes and like rejecting a particular posture towards making money and being cool and fancy, even though there's like a cool hierarchy within their like group of people in terms of like who's joking and that sort of thing. But yeah.
Yeah. The one that hits that point for me is Out Cold.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Which is like which is like a little bit more modern. And it's, you know, like there's like the like dirtbag ski bums who are like up against like the rich guy who's going to come own the mountain.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, it's like totally sets up that sort of like, I think there is sort of, and Aspen Extreme actually gets into this a lot too. There sort of is this like cultural idea of like, okay, we're the like hardcore real skiers.
Yeah.
And then there's like the Bryce Kellogg fancy people who are on vacation. And there's this sort of like battle between the like people who are doing it for the love of the sport and then the people who are doing it to like be on vacation and make money or like be elite.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think Aspen Extreme in a lot of ways is sort of a movie about class issues.
Yes.
And about like who can afford to exist in a ski town.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the reason why skiers are annoying is in many ways the reason why people who are super into any hobby and are trying to evangelize for it can be annoying, right?
No, totally.
Runners are super annoying. Golfers are like...
Or like hearing people talk about their vacation is annoying.
So there are so many reasons
yeah.
why skiing could be annoying. But I praise this person for holding strong against not wanting to ski.
Yeah, and I think there are like, I think there are ways you can find your way and that don't have to feel like that.
Yeah. Okay, this next question continues to get at this theme of class divide. This comes from Carolyn, and Melody's going to read it.
As an avid skier of all sorts, I grapple with loving a sport so much while disliking many facets of the culture. One thing that makes me uncomfy as someone who visits ski towns often is the widening gap between people who own property in a ski town — I can't say live because it's often a second home or a rental property — and the people who live to work there. Aside from generally not being an asshole, how can I be a better patron to those who live there when visiting a ski town? Is there anything we can do as tourists visiting ski towns to ensure that the working class in ski towns are able to live where they work? This kind of applies to tourism in general, which I'm interested in as a larger discussion as well.
Well, this is such a good question.
Such a good question in so many ways that we can take it. So first, can you describe, like when I think of this town, I think of Whitefish, Montana, but there's so many similar towns. In many ways, it's not possible for people who work there to actually live in the town proper anymore.
Yeah. And this is, when I dug into the research for this book, one of the big things that I was looking at was like the economic inequalities in ski industry as a whole, and then in ski towns in particular, which is huge. They're some of the most, the Gini coefficient is like the sort of economic measure for inequality. I looked at Aspen when I was looking at this, but a lot of ski towns are like so far on the end of the spectrum of inequality because you have people who come in, and a lot of times people like say in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, a lot of times people will say that's their primary residence because of tax benefits. And so the top of the pile of income and economics is really, 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 really high. And then the other side of that is that ski towns and any kind of recreation town or tourist town is inherently dependent on the service industry. Yeah. And so you have people, cleaning hotel rooms, working in restaurants, who are necessary for these towns to exist. But the way that the economy skews is that the value of things, and housing, I think, is like the biggest example of this, is totally divorced from the wages in the town. Yep. So you have like the cost of things, like the market's broken and the cost of things doesn't align with what you might make in that town. And housing, I think, is really like the most clear way of looking at this because, land is a finite resource. And a lot of these places, especially with the, I don't know where Airbnb is right now, but like with the rise of Airbnb, a lot of places that could have been long-term housing for people who live in these towns have been turned into short-term rentals. There's a lot of places that sit empty, 49 weeks a year because there's somebody's second home. And I think that is sort of like a really clear example of how these systems are broken and we've kind of like baked ourselves into a divided society. And I think that to me, I think like ski towns are such an interesting microcosm for what's happening in a lot of places, you know, in a lot of cities. But I think that gap is really real. And I think acknowledging that and like seeing that is a piece of it. And I think that as visitors, I mean, what you can do is stay in hotels because hotels pay taxes and employ people. And that's sort of like a small example. But then I think, that like, what can we do as visitors is sort of an interesting question.
I have actually the solution, which is you buy property, and then you turn it into an affordable rental, like actual rental property for people to live in full time, and like allow dogs and allow like 6 people to be on the lease and make it into a group housing.
Yeah, property taxes are high. The cost of property is high, and a lot of ski towns and mountain towns were pretty progressive and sort of ahead of the curve on affordable housing. Yeah. Aspen actually was really way out ahead of it. And, you know, affordable housing was this like bad urban thing, but they can't keep up with the demand on that. And a lot of places, like even though they're buying, you know, like market rate or affordable housing, they can't house their employees. They can't house, you know, the people, the teachers or the firefighters. There was I think it was Steamboat, had a job opening for like an HR person, like the person who would like fix this problem, and they couldn't afford to live in the town.
Yeah.
So, and I think there's a lot of other places, like obviously the housing is a big piece of this, but there's a lot of other pieces of the puzzle. There's been an effort in the past couple of years to unionize a lot of on-mountain workers.
Yeah.
Like a couple of ski patrols have unionized recently. So there is this sort of in-town work to like create a more equitable labor market, which is really hard, especially in places where the economy is run by the ski resort, which is often owned by a big conglomerate. Yeah. And they have a lot of power. So I think as somebody who's like coming in and as a visitor, it's like be in the town, use the services that are like within your means, you know, go to the local restaurants, tip your servers. Yeah.
But also and I think if you're visiting the town, there isn't a ton that you can do like to change that particular town because you're not like you don't have the voting power to do things like put real restrictions on Airbnb rentals, right? Which is something that a lot of tourist towns and ski towns have started to do in order to open up that long-term rental market. And by long-term rental, I mean, so short-term rentals are Airbnbs, VRBOs, like places where people have decided, okay, I own this property. I can make a lot more money doing short-term rentals than renting to a bunch of ski bums or not even ski bums. That's the thing is it's not as like simple as like, oh, this is a bunch of 22-year-olds who are going to live and wreck my house. It's more like,
it's like, okay, this is a 4th grade teacher.
Who also skis every weekend, right? Like, or maybe not, but who lives and works in the town and makes it the place that it is.
Yeah. And I think it's like, I'm really interested to see what's going to happen in a lot of these places in the next 5 to 10 years, because I think eventually the economy starts to collapse if like you don't have the people working those jobs. And I've been picking on Aspen, but I think Aspen's an interesting example. I was there last winter and somebody was telling me that and I think this is like getting to the last question about like, why are skiers assholes? A lot of people will come in now and these really elite places and also show up with like their own private chef, their own housekeeping staff, their own groundskeepers. So they're just sort of like importing their own lives. And I think that gets so far out on the line of like, you're not engaging with the community and with the world. But I think if we can fight that or like, don't be that guy.
Oh my gosh. And it just really gets at the heart too of like people who buy a place in one of these towns and they're like, okay, I want to be able to stay in my own place for the 2 weeks that I go there. And it's going to sit empty for the other 50 weeks. And it's because I want what I want in the way that I want it, at the time that I want it. Instead of I'll stay in a hotel for a week or like I'll find a place to stay or something. But like this incredible like focus on immediacy and like having everything the exact way that you want it. And also, like you said, like having a private chef who like makes you dinner at the place. Like my best memories of the place where we would go skiing, like we stayed in like a motel where like you went in the hot tub and like everyone always got hot tub rash, right? Like it's like not a great sitch. And then but you would go out to dinner because that was kind of your only choice, was to go out to one of like, you know, the affordable places in town, and the best burger place was this place called Lardo's. And like it would just be filled with like stinky people who still were wearing their bibs, right? Like there was a real piece to the entire experience that was like being out in the community and being part of that, and not like, as I've heard is now the case at a place like Whistler, like you have to make reservations for any place that you want to eat once you're done skiing. Like,
Yeah. And it
so
sort of is an
different.
interesting question too. Like this is something I've been asking myself lately, is like, what is travel for? Or what is a
Yeah.
vacation for? Like
Yeah.
if you're like taking all the time and effort to go to these places, like what is the experience that you want to have when you're there? And I think for me, I'm always sort of like, oh yeah, what are the local, what are the local stores? What do people who live here do? But I think
Mhm.
if you want to have that sort of comfort level of like, I know what I like to eat, I want things to be the way they are,
Yeah.
you can, I mean, maybe not everybody, but like there's a sector of people who can achieve that. And you can
Right.
have the like, Amazon groceries already there when you get there. Like you can
Mhm.
kind of have the pieces in place the way you like them.
Yeah.
But like, what are you missing out on if you set it up like that?
And I think that the rise of like mountain camping, so what I mean by that is like people who stay at the mountain in like vans or trucks that are oftentimes like, some are totally kitted out and some are like, I have a crappy generator so that I can like not freeze in my car overnight. But there's like a real community feel amongst the people that are like, people sit around and like hang out with one another, barbecue, whatever. Like that's almost like this overflow from people who've been shut out of like the experience of the town. You're like, oh, here's a way as a family that we can all go
We could
skiing
potentially do
together.
it. Yeah. It's interesting. I'm like guilty, was like one of those people, like the van life people.
Yeah.
And
But I
yeah,
don't
like,
think it's guilt. Like, I don't think it's a bad thing. Do you know what I
but I
mean?
think
Like,
there's like sort of an evolution of that too, where like we
yeah.
had a van that my husband had for years, and it was like, had a bed, had a heater, and it was like he had built it out. It was pretty bare bones. And I think that we used it a lot during COVID. And I think
Yeah.
this is also like a Northwest thing where
Yeah.
you can camp in the parking lots in a lot of places.
Yeah.
And there was this rise, I think, driven by COVID, of like the van bros,
Yeah.
where all of a sudden, like, there was this huge market for like your $100,000 Sprinter van that you had built out. And we were
Yeah.
in the parking lot at Mount Bachelor in Bend. And one of his friends who lives there was like, we didn't have a pandemic in Bend, we had a vandemic. Where like all of a sudden, all of these people who could like work remotely and had flexibility
Yeah.
bought these fancy vans and like
Uh-huh.
showed up in the ski areas.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there is this sort of like, that gets stratified too.
Totally. No, it's totally right. And then I think about the woman I took a chair with the other day who like slept in the back of her car. She specified, she said, my car. And she was like, it was only 33. It was okay. I met
I've
some
got a good
fun
sleeping
people.
bag. Yeah.
I have a good sleeping bag. Who like just drove up from Bellingham and wanted to like get first tracks. And she did it by herself. That's a different, I think, sort of attitude than like that. Like,
Yeah.
I will only go and camp in my van if my van costs $100,000.
Yeah, and it has a lot of things. And I think that kind of gets back to that like sort of like obsession part
Yeah.
too. And it's like, what do you do and sacrifice and like get uncomfortable for because you love this stupid thing?
Yeah, totally. Totally. Okay, so this is about the future of skiing. It's something I think about a lot. This comes from Lisa.
Should I give up on my dream of skiing with my kids? I grew up skiing in the Catskills with my entire extended family every weekend, grandparents and cousins and everybody. Now that I have my own kids, I have no idea how they did it. It seems impossible. Tickets and lessons are just entirely out of reach financially. How did my parents' generation do this for all of us? Was it just much cheaper 30 years ago? When did it get so expensive? And more painfully, there's just not enough snow. My grandmother skied 70 days in a row the year that she turned 70. I don't know if there were 70 days in a row where you even could ski near where I lived last year. I always wanted to raise my own ski buddies, but is it cruel to encourage my kids to love a sport that might not last until they're adults?
Oh.
Yeah, I hear you.
So we've talked about the financial piece of this a bit, but I wonder how much do you think that the rising cost can be connected in some ways to climate change?
I think they are related. I think just because on some level it is the cost of operating a ski area and the sort of like risk that
Yeah.
the business of skiing has to take
Yeah.
in the face of less stable winters is really real.
Yeah.
And a lot of, smaller local ski areas, like a lot of ones that I know, have closed because they can't ride that kind of like wave of you have a bad winter and then you have like another bad winter in a row, and you just don't have the financial insulation for that. And even like, it's end of December here. It hasn't snowed in weeks where I live in southern Colorado. And I was on a run this morning with a friend who was talking about another friend who owns a snowmobiling company. Like they kind of do tours, and he's out there, he has to make snow this year to kind of like keep his business going. So like the investment becomes way higher. But I think more on this is the way I think about it for myself, because I think about this all the time. Like, is it stupid to be doing this thing and thinking about this thing and like obsessed with this thing that could go away soon? Or like even in a year like this where it's December and it hasn't been that good, it's like you get your hopes up and you get sort of like a little heartbroken, let down, and crabby and cranky.
I mean, that was me last year. I was so freaking cranky and I mean, last year we had like an incredibly crappy year, and the way that I thought about my pass was that like like I lost money on it, but like you can't sometimes, especially if you're with a smaller ski mountain, like I didn't think of it as losing money. I thought of it as a way that I was sustaining this mountain for future years, because it is a local family-owned mountain.
Your CSA. And I think it is like in terms of like, should you not get your kids hooked on this like unreliable drug? I think it's sort of like, I guess the way I think about it is like, I don't want to, yes, the future looks scary and sketchy, but I don't want to like give up on the thing before I have to give up on the thing. And I don't want to like live in fear of it not existing. Yeah. And I also think that there's a level that, and I think this is true in terms of like a lot of different kinds of recreation and how we're thinking about sort of like, where can we be? What does the future of climate and the outdoors look like? That kind of obsession and love also leads to a kind of care.
Yeah.
And like, it's really hard to care about things that you don't care about.
Yeah.
And having that sort of like hook in, I think, gives people an emotional sense of emotional resonance and a way to sort of like personally connect themselves to place. Like, I think I have that, like, you probably have this too. I have this like personal barometer of like my birthday's in January. It's supposed to be snowy on my birthday. And like, when it's not, okay, what does that mean? What am I seeing here?
Yeah.
And I think it's also like, I don't know, to go back to that idea of hobbies and joy. That's why we're doing it. And like to have to like give up on that sense of joy out of fear seems really sad to me.
Yeah. I do think that like sometimes, especially if you want to do something like this as a family and want it to be financially sustainable, that if it's not local, it might not be possible.
Yeah.
And that's hard.
I think that's the same. Like, maybe this is like getting a little loose, but I think it's the same with like food systems or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like, can you support the thing that like actually supports your community and like maybe brings joy? And like, that's obviously not, it sounds like you and I both live in places where we do have that like local ski mountain, and that's obviously not true for a lot of people, but can you sort of engage with like the smaller scale local, the piece of it that actually is sustainable on some level?
Yeah.
And that's hard because like a lot of times those places are also the ones that don't have the infrastructure to make them as resilient to climate and can't ride those waves as much. But
yeah. And also like the places that maybe we remember skiing are not necessarily the places that you can ski sustainably anymore. And whether that's because the character of that place has changed. So I grew up skiing, it was Brundage Mountain in McCall, Idaho, and McCall has changed significantly since then. Or like in skiing in the Catskills, like, or skiing in Vermont, like the predictability, the reliability of weather in those places, and all places, but especially I think in the East.
Yeah. So I think it is like, there is some level of like, you have to live in the like I thought a lot about nostalgia in this too, because I think so much of like ski culture is about this sort of like
Oh my God.
old school nostalgia. This is what we wear. This is what the seasons are like. And I think there's like something that really like hits me in the chest about that, but you also can't live. You have to like also live where we are right now.
Yeah, no, it's climate grief for sure.
Maybe this is me getting like Pollyanna about it, but like, is that your sort of like wedge into like feeling something about it?
Yeah.
And like having context on your own life.
Yeah.
Like how it impacts you.
Yeah, I feel like I'm so much more in touch with the way that like winter works and the rhythms of winter and like how El Nino and La Nina work because of becoming a skier again.
Yeah. Being outside, and especially in the winter when it's so easy to like be inside and be insulated and be in front of screens, it's like that's the being out in it is like the cure for it in a lot of ways, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yesterday, so it snowed all day on the mountain, turning into rain at the end of the day. And
classic Northwest.
I know, going is atmospheric river that then like it rained so hard on the way home and like so intensely that it at 4 p.m. it was so dark. And like in another scenario, it would be so bleak, just like looking outside and it's dark at 4 p.m. But I was like, I spent all day outside being ridiculous, like wringing out my mittens because the snow was so wet. Like I feel great in a very different way than I would if I had stared at a computer screen all day and then
100%
looked up to that. So, Heather's going to stick around for the subscriber-only Ask Ann Anything segment today. So this question, it's not about skiing, but it is about another area of her expertise, which is deciding where to live when you can technically live anywhere. If you want that part of the conversation, head to culturestudypod.substack.com and become a paid subscriber. Well, this has been fantastic and lived up to all of my expectations. So thank you for that.
There's so much more we could talk about.
I know. Where can people find you if they want to hear more from you?
My website is heatherhansman.com, and I'm H Hansman on most social media, probably Instagram more than anything these days.
Same.
I'm in an interesting relationship with that right now.
Yeah.
And really go to your local bookstore, like local indie bookstore. Do that.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you. This is so fun.
Thank you so much for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We have so many great episodes in the works, and I promise you don't want to miss any of them. If you want to suggest a topic, ask a question about the culture that surrounds you, or submit a question for our subscriber-only advice time segment, check the show notes for a link to our Substack. If you want to support the show and get bonus content, head to culturestudypod.substack.com. It's $5 a month or $50 a year, and you'll get ad-free episodes, an exclusive advice time segment, weekly discussion threads for each episode, and a link to a special Google form so that your questions go to the front of the line. The Culture Study Podcast is produced by me, Anne Helen Peterson, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear. You can find me on Instagram at Anne Helen Peterson, Melody at Melodious47, and the show at Culture Study Pod. Thank you so much for your support.